Okay, it gives me great pleasure to welcome this week's speaker, Professor Mark Bush, who is Professor of Biology at the Florida Institute of Technology, and he earned his BSc and PhD at the University of Hull in the UK, and then was a postdoc at Ohio State University and at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And then he was briefly at Duke before being persuaded to move to a warmer climate and has been faculty at Florida Tech since 1996. And his work covers a whole range of things. We've collaborated for almost two decades now in the Andes in particular, but it's this pretty fascinating combination of biogeography, ecology, paleoclimatology, and archaeology to understand the present day ecology and the long-term prehistoric ecology of the Andes Amazon region. So thank you for presenting to us today, Mark, and over to you.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to just share my screen. So thanks very much for the invitation, Yadvinda. It's a great pleasure to be here and to chat with everyone today. My topic today is talking about pre-Columbian land use and what those legacies may be going into modern ecology. So let's start off with some things that we do know about Amazonia. So we know that people have been in the Amazon basin for the entirety of the Holocene. Their numbers were gradually increasing during that time, as we'll talk about. And that occupation and their impacts were largely centered along major rivers because they made the greatest connectivity, and it was the source of food and everything else. In the last 3,000 years, that pattern may have begun to change as cultivation became more important than a sort of hunter-gatherer existence. And also as societies started to truly form, rather than having hunter-gatherer bands moving around in sort of ephemeral occupations, we start to see sort of sophisticated patterns of roads, of villages, that appear to have sort of some kind of organization to them that suggests that there's a sort of complex societal structure developing as well for the last 2,000 years. And so we have this sort of momentum of land use and occupation building throughout the Holocene, but accelerating probably within the last 2,000 years. The paper by Goldberg here suggests a sort of a model for how that population trajectory may have appeared to be. And she's using calibrated 14 carbon ages on archaeological data to make inferences about where people were in South America. And you can see that according to her timeline here, we have people in the sort of the eastern fringes of the Amazon and the western fringes. So the center of the Amazon basically unoccupied, right at the end of the Pleistocene, but people milling around the edges of it. And that pattern, according to her model, pretty much persists throughout with this buildup of occupation, especially in the Andes. But we know that this isn't quite the complete story. We also know that the last 2,000 years, which her model doesn't touch, was very important to what was going on within Amazonia. So if we transition now to thinking about actual archaeological data and where we know people were and so on. We've got this figure that came from Crystal McMichael's paper in PNAS back in 2017, and she's mapped here ADEs, Amazonian dark earths, also known as terra preta, and these are these modified soils. So this is a native soil that you get typically in the Amazon andesols, or something which is basically very nutrient poor, clay rich, and so on. And then if you add a lot of organic material, either feces, ash, bone meal, just kitchen waste, you end up with what has archaeologists term an Amazonian dark earth or terra preta. And these things are important because they're much higher carbon content, they're much higher nitrogen, phosphorus content, trace minerals. And so they make a robust growing soil that doesn't just get exhausted after a growing season or two. So this map shows the Amazonian dark earths, which are known and mapped so far. Do we know all of them? Absolutely not. Do we know most of them? Probably, because they're so fertile, the local farmers do already know where they are. So these Amazonian dark earths, a few of them date back to sort of 6,000 years or so, but for the most part, they seem to have been within the last 3,000 years with a sort of peak of creation within the last 2,000 years. We also see down in this, this area of the Amazon down towards the sort of southern edge of the basin, we see geoglyphs. And these are large sort of 100-meter kind of scale, 200-meter kind of scale, ring ditches or squares or connecting rectangles and things. So clearly they're earthworks. We don't know what they were there for. They're not habitation sites, maybe ceremonial, but that's a sort of cop-out that archaeologists use when they don't know what else to say about something. But they were obviously quite an effort to build and probably not a one-person occupation. And so these things tend to be clustered here, although as deforestation proceeds, we're seeing them in other areas as well. So we don't really know the full extent of geoglyphs in the Amazon, but again, they date to that period between 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago for the most part. There are other archaeological settings sort of scattered across all of the Amazon, and this is not a complete map of archaeological settings by any means in the Amazon, but we also have lake sites, again, scattered around the Amazon that provide us some detail. And part of today's talk is to add to those constellation of lake sites and to put this into a sort of a slightly different perspective. I do want to touch on one thing though, as we look at a map like this, and that is to realize the fallacy of the mapper, right? So if I take this dot here, right, that's a terra preta site. And to scale, that site will be about 50 kilometers in diameter. All these terra preta sites, almost all of them, are a hectare or less. And so when we see this sort of dark cluster of stuff just solid along the main tributary rivers and the main Amazon channel, we have to understand that this is not an accurate map that is in any sense to scale for these features. Okay, so that's what we know about the Amazon. Let's get on to what we think we know about the Amazon. And so when Columbus arrived into the New World, we know that disease came with him. Smallpox, measles, influenza, a whole host of diseases that afflicted the local population who were not immune in any sense. They hadn't been exposed to this in 10,000 years or so. And so these were very virulent infections. And we know from Mexico, for example, which is where the woodcut comes from, that smallpox ravaged the population there and caused an immense amount of damage to that population. And we also know from some of the Caribbean islands that as many as 90% of the population is estimated to have died on those islands as a result of this kind of contact. In Amazonia, it's far less clear what that mortality was. It's generally taken to be 90 to 95% of reduction in population between 1550 and 1750. And that's a compound of disease, enslavement, warfare, just sort of social breakdown, all conspiring to reduce the Amazonian population. And so over here on the right is something which Miles Silman and I put out a few years ago, just sort of outlining the different ideas of Amazonian population. So we have low counters, people who really don't believe there are many people living in the Amazon at the time of European contact. They put that at about 1 million. I think this is pretty much discredited. There's medium counters who put the population in the Amazon at 3 to 5 million. And then we can have what we might think of as high counters who put it in as 8 to 10 million. There's a huge uncertainty around all these numbers, and everyone recognizes that. The curve, though, here suggests what might have happened with this 90% drop off in population, and a few of the sort of people who observed along the river. So there are some data points in here. In 1525, Huayna Capac, who is the Inca at the time, died of what appears to have been smallpox. And you'll note that that came ahead of the invasion by the Europeans in 1532 when Pizarro arrived in Peru. So the smallpox would have preceded European arrival by a few years as a result of trade and being moved around through the continent. So that's entirely plausible. So we know that there were, and that wave of disease probably helped to destabilize the Inca and set up make it much easier for Pizarro and his cohort to conquer them. But when we come to the Amazon, there's much less information. The first navigation down the Amazon was in 1542, 1543 by Orellana, and the reports from that give no indication of a diseased population. So there is nothing there to suggest that that people were, hostile to intruders, or that there was evidence that people were suffering from disease or anything. So it does not appear to have been critically important in 1541. In 1743, there's an account from a Frenchman, de la Condamine, who's a surveyor going down the Amazon, and he was incredibly negative about the local population in many ways. And he obviously just didn't like the indigenous people that he came across. And it's difficult, he said very little about them. But again, there was nothing in his writing to say that they were suffering unduly from disease or anything else. So we have this two eyewitness accounts, there are one or two in between who really, again, don't tell us anything. So we don't have definitive evidence of this what's become known as the Great Dying within the Amazon. I'm not saying it didn't happen. It's just that the eyewitness accounts don't tell us anything about it. So we're then left with this impression that we have this major die-off in people sometime between 1550 and 1750, and that has ecological repercussions, because if you have that amount of mortality, you'd have an abandonment of the land. And so if we go from an occupied site where people are growing maize, manioc, other crops like that, they've maybe enriched the forest with fruiting trees and so on, but they've thinned the forest out, at least around where they're living, then if they move off the land and if they abandon the land because they died or they just have drifted away to some other part of the forest, then we'd expect a successional recovery to take place. And we all know that successional recoveries soak up a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, and that keeps going for quite a long time as you go through the mid-succession, and it's not until you get into really mature forest, not just 100 years, but probably 400 years plus, that you move into a system which is no longer absorbing carbon and is basically carbon neutral. So we should be able to detect some of these changes. If it was this major a transition, we should be able to see these things in the pollen records. But it's also been suggested that we see these things in carbon stocks at that time. We may be able to see it in the age of the forest today, and also in the composition of the forest today. So these are all then relating back to our modern ecology and our modern ecological view, where we're interested in carbon sequestration, forest structure, resilience, all those kinds of things. They're affected by how old the forest is. And if these forests are truly dating from 1750, not from time immemorial, then we have quite a different Amazon on our hands than previously thought. It's been suggested that the Orbis spike, this dip in CO2 that occurred around about 1610 to 1620, was part of this story, that regrowth in forest in the New World as a whole triggered the Orbis spike, sucked carbon out of the atmosphere, and gave us a decade or so of lowered carbon, which actually continued for the best part of 2 centuries. If that's the case, again, we should be able to see a forest recovery in the fossil pollen record that would align with this. Now, is the Amazon the only place where this would be important? No, it could have been in other parts of the New World, but Koch, in a paper that came out in 2019, estimates that a little more than half of this carbon would have probably come from the Amazon basin, just because other areas, Central America, for example, where there's high productivity, but there's just not that much land mass. Or if you go to the boreal forest of Canada, it's not that productive. The US itself, maybe that could have played a role, but we don't know of that much deforestation and recovery within the US. So Amazonia would be the best target for such a high potential for carbon uptake if that happened. So then this leads us then back to some major unknowns really, which is the size of pre-Columbian human populations. We have this huge uncertainty about how many people were there. How much did they influence the ecosystems that they lived in? Again, did they have a light footprint, or were they clearing the forest horizon to horizon, which is what some archaeologists have actually espoused? And then what was the impact of European arrival? And was it something which was synchronous? Was it spread out over several hundred years? What does that look like? And so that's really some of the things I want to talk about today. I'm certainly not going to put any numbers on how big pre-Columbian populations were or anything like that, but I am going to look to see if we can see this forest regeneration associated with European arrival. And this is a continental scale problem, and my understanding of it evolves continuously. But my present understanding came about through lots of little pieces of information that we've been accumulating and other labs have been accumulating over a long period of time. And today, trying to keep this short and sweet, I'm going to start our story with a record from actually Greater Amazonia, which is the catchment of Amazonia, but set at 2,850 meters elevation. So it's not what we think of as the lowland Amazon for sure, but it's part of the mental process that led us to where we are today. So this is Lake Condors, and it's here in northern Peru. And I'm going to touch on these other two lakes, Pomocochas and Sauce, as we talk about this, but we're going to start with Lake Condors. It lies at 2,850 meters elevation. Here's the lake. It's famous, also known as the Lake of the Mummies. And these burial chambers in a sheer white cliff beside the lake revealed about 200 mummies. They had scaffolds outside with some of these mummies and things. And so this is a really great trove of information about the Chachapoya and the Inca. At first, it was thought that these were going to be Chachapoyan mummies. The Chachapoya was the group that lived in this part of the Andes prior to Incan arrival. The Inca fought the Chachapoya repeatedly. They were very warlike people, and it took about 20 years to sort of suppress them. And so between 1450 and 1470 AD, the Inca were battling the Chachapoya, eventually victorious. Now, it was thought that these mummies were going to be, or these burials were going to be associated with the Chachapoya initially, because on the banks, on this side of the lake, on this ridge, that's where this picture was taken, and these are Chachapoyan houses. Chachapoya classically built circular houses about 3 to 5 meters in diameter. Inca tended to build rectangular houses, so this was immediately evident these were Chachapoyan homesteads. And so it was thought that the burials would be associated with them. As it turns out, they're not. There are some Chachapoyan burials there, but probably what happened is the Inca came through, decided this was a really great place to have their mummies, and they probably tossed out any burials that preceded their own. And so all these mummies, almost all these mummies that have been recovered are actually from Incan times. So we got into this lake. It was a 23-mile walk to get in here. The lake is 80 meters deep, which presented some challenges for coring it, but we got a relatively short 3-meter core out of that lake, and it went back 2,000 years. And so this is a sort of mixture of pollen and chemistry records and diatoms and charcoal and things from this site. And I'll just walk you through it quickly. So we got time from 0 AD through to modern on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have these various curves. So, for example, sediment titanium gives you an index of erosion. And so these are when we have peaks of erosion. We've got an important one here, which is sedimentary carbonate. This is from loss on ignition, so the data set is coarser, but we know exactly what it is. That's carbonate, and you can see that these peaks align with these purple peaks beneath them, which is calcium divided by titanium from XRF data. And again, these two give us a very strong signature of drought. If titanium is your inwash, and you see that during these troughs here, this is when there's less inwash coming into the lake. So there's less eroding material. And when you couple that with peaks of calcium, that is because the lake is evaporating and the calcium carbonate then is being deposited. And so this tells us when we have peak drought intervals in this record. And we can see that those drought intervals then also tend to correspond to times when we lose some of the forest cover. This is the, this is disturbance taxa pollen here. And so this is the disturbance taxa peak up during these periods. The forest cover would go down during these periods. And in this window, it's sort of the pink background color here. This was the peak of the disturbance in this setting. We've got major signals of charcoal in here and all this erosion taking place. And up the top here, we've got maize. So each of these pluses represents a sample where we found maize. And so we find it's almost continuous through this period here. But then as we get out of this and into the transition phase here, we start to thin out on the maize. And then this section here, we're in forest regrowth. And so we see the disturbance taxa dropping way down here. This is just forest taxa then replacing all these. And the forestry is regrowing. Now, as you can see, people are still, they haven't abandoned this site completely. They're just using it less intensively. And so that's one of the things to understand about these records is that we don't necessarily get complete abandonment at any setting, but we do get a forest response in that setting. So here, the forest response really is here, is at about 1250 AD, is we see this recovery of the forest and a decline of the disturbance signal. And after that, once people stop really disturbing the forest, all these other lines calm down because you don't get these same signatures when the forest cover is in place. It's an amplified signal that you get when people are disturbing the landscape. And the very bottom signal down here is our oligotrophic versus eutrophic indicators in the diatoms. And we can see that when we've got lots of disturbance here, we've got an enriched system, it's being sort of polluted basically, and it takes a while to clean up. But then once the forest cover is back in place, we start to see the water quality improving as well. So I said we wanted to look at this site in the context of these two other locations, Permacochus, which is 110 kilometers away, and Sauce, which is 160 kilometers away. And these form an elevational gradient. So Condors is at 2850 meters, Permacochus is at 2000 meters, and Sauce is down at 650 meters, just as the Amazon basin proper breaks away from the Andes. Okay, so there's quite a lot to unpack in these diagrams. So we're going to just look at Condors first. The green line here is forest cover over the last 2,000 years. And as you can see, this forest cover sort of was edging down through this time and then turns around about this point and goes back up again. The brown is grass pollen. And you can see that when you have, these two are basically inverse signals. As you have deforestation, so you get more grass in the system. And we can see that the grass fades away here. So the last burst of activity in this system is here with lots of deforestation, renewed deforestation, and a burst of grass cover. But then after about 1250 AD, that's when the whole thing stabilizes back into forest. This is when the mummies, this is the Incan mummies, were here in the 1470 to 1500 period. And we see that this is during the period of the forest recovery. There's a little bit of maize agriculture still going on, and the gold bars here represent the proportion of samples within a century that had maize. So here in these samples, we had 80% of the samples, 70% of the samples that we counted for this century had maize in them. Here, there's 0. Here, there's 0. In other words, we're seeing that the intensity of the land use changed, and that when the mummies were being put into the cliffs, the land use had actually shifted away completely from maize agriculture. So the choice then was to have this probably as a sacred site where the belief is that they looked out across the valley onto, the mummies would look out across the valley onto something they wanted to see, which in this case was a forest. The gray in the background is a cave isotope record, just showing wetter versus drier. So the higher the values here, the wetter it was. And we interpreted this Condors record primarily as being a record of when there was drought, there was a lot more people in the landscape using the landscape more intensively. That's what these peaks align to, these periods of drought. This is another drought period here. And as we get into an overall wetter climate, after sort of about 1300, then there's just simply no more use, agricultural use for this setting. This is a cloud forest setting. Cloud forest at 2,850 meters, socked in with cloud at ground level a lot of the time, very wet, not a great place to be unless you're in the middle of a drought. And so that's why droughts favored people moving in opportunistically into this landscape, but they would also move back out again to some extent when conditions got wetter. Okay, so that's Condors. Now, the same idea here for the lake at 2,000 meters at Pomocochus. And here what we see is that the peak of clearance is actually back at about 400 AD. It coincides with this major peak of clearance and activity at Condors. And that after that, this record has another burst of activity here. But once this progression towards becoming wetter kicks in, then this site reverts to forest. And so we're starting to think about this then as a pattern where we have the deforestation is really not very active in the last 1,000 years at these higher elevation settings. And it seems to be that as the setting becomes wetter, presumably cloudier, it's just not good for storing grain. It's not a nice place to live. And so people basically move out of that setting as much as possible. I'm sure there's still people there, but the number of people, the intensity of use goes down. And then we look at the lowlands at Salsay. Salsay is a much drier setting than these two. And we see that the maize agriculture here is sustained much longer. We have this sort of early peak, just like in the other settings, but we also have sustained maize here until we get up to about 1350. We have a little bit of a gap there. Then we have another spike at about 1450. And then we have a gap in terms of maize agriculture until we get firmly into colonial times. Again, if we're looking at the forest cover, what we see here is that the forest cover was wavering between sort of 50% and 70% for a long period of time, but then after about 1250 AD, it stabilizes much more, being a higher percentage of forest cover until we get into sort of about 1800 when we get the first traces of modern occupation there. So we were then very curious to see whether these patterns would hold up somewhere else. Well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is just us trying to sort of put this thought into a cartoon about the cloud and how the cloud would impact this stuff. So a lot of you are familiar with the base of the cloud in the Andes being something about 1,500 meters elevation. By the time you're up to 2,000 meters elevation, that's pretty socked in with cloud. It's a difficult place to grow a lot of crops. And if you're up at 3,200 or you're close to the top of things. And Condors at 2,850 maybe was just oscillating in and out of that cloud according to how the droughts were running. So this is our sort of cartoon trying to think this through in terms of why Salsay would have a longer maize agricultural record, why Condors would be the, Permacoaches would be the most sensitive, and Condors still sensitive, but a little less sensitive than Permacoaches. And so that was our sort of climatic explanation of what's going on. But it doesn't explain why Salsay shows a decline. Just go back a moment. It doesn't explain this portion of the Salsay record. Why was maize agriculture basically turned off here sometime before 1500 AD? Did they just switch? Did they go to some other crop? That seems pretty odd. I mean, they've been using maize so perpetually there for, actually this record goes back 6,000 years. So why switch then? So that was, what instigated us to think about what would go on at some other Amazonian sites. And what we also realized was it was the high resolution nature of this record, Condors and Permacoaches, that allowed us to see patterns that previously a lot of us who've been working in the Amazon were really interested in what was going on in the Ice Age, and the Holocene was more or less written off as just being, it's not very interesting. And now we realize that actually there's a lot of information in the last 2,000 years that actually does matter, and just simply saying, oh, human occupation starts here is not the end of the story. So Lake Kumpak in Ecuador is a really great potential site for us. Paul Colombo and his team had cored it in the 1980s, and there's a paper out from 1985 giving a 5,000 year history. We went back and recored this lake, got exactly the same core length that they did, about 17 meters of mud. And we also reflew their aerial image that they had done in 1983. And so this is the 2014 image here. And we then tried to map where there was deforestation within the basin. And basically we can see that there hasn't been a lot of change really in the last 30 years in this site. But the record, because you've got 17 meters of mud spanning 5,000 years, means you've got a good rate of sediment accumulation, and that allowed us to do a fine resolution pollen analysis on this. And so this is Christine Ackerson's work, as was Condors, I should have said. And this formed part of her PhD thesis. And here we can see that in just the last 2,300 years of pollen and phytolith, which came out of Crystal McMichael's group at University of Amsterdam, these analyses tell a very similar story. So we have two waves here of disturbance where there's maize agriculture taking place, with forest recovery in between, both of them. So the pollen gives us a bit more information about the successional species that are in there, and the phytolith actually gives a little bit more sensitivity, maybe for maize, than we get from the pollen. But basically, as I say, the story is very consistent. The pluses here show where charcoal samples were counted, and the only time we get quantitative amounts of charcoal is the modern disturbance which happened post-1963 when a Silesian mission was established at the lake. Prior to that, we have tiny, tiny fragments of charcoal showing up just a couple of times. And this is continuous sampling through the system, basically. So we don't think we're missing fire events. These people were maybe not using much in the way of slash and burn. This may have been more slash and mulch that they were using around this lake, with fire as a sort of minor component of what was going on. So we do have to rely much more heavily here on the pollen and the phytoliths than on charcoal. We do have XRF data, and we're still working on those. So It suggests then that this site was used, but almost, if not entirely abandoned, certainly functionally abandoned in the sense that the forest was able to recover and that there was more or less a complete cessation of crop pollen taking place. The cloudiness argument here really doesn't work. Right? This is down in the lowlands at 300 meters elevation. This has got to be a different explanation for why people will be moving into and out of this lake. So Kulp then is here, and it's one of 39 Amazonian lakes that we compile the records for them in terms of disturbance. Now the lakes have got different qualities of data. And so 9 of these lakes we can think of as being more highly resolved than the others. And the other 30 give us the sort of the background. But if we take those 39 as a whole, this is their distribution across the Amazon basin. These are the ones that were either unoccupied or occupied. And so we see that the vast majority of them show occupation, especially around the periphery of the Amazon. We do have some which are unoccupied. Some of these ones down near Iquitos, Quistococha. We have Lake Pata, which is up on the Hill of Six Lakes. And that's a really sort of weird landscape. No one would want to be up there. You couldn't farm it, do anything. It's very thin soils. And so for the most part, these lakes do show a history of occupation, but we have these sites which are unoccupied, which sort of form an informal control, basically, for us, for what climate might be doing. If we look at the forest change associated with that period of the Great Dying, 1550 to 1750, and we look across these lakes and we say, was the forest increasing or decreasing compared with the time bin before that? We find that some of the lakes in mauve here were decreasing in their forest cover. And this is a time when we need the forest to be recovering, building carbon stocks, if we're going to see that Orbis spike explained by forest recovery. And we have about the same number of sites here, which were showing at least 5% increase in forest cover compared to the previous one. 5% is not very much, but it is possibly a difference between having no disturbance signal and some disturbance. So it is not a trivial amount, but when we see that there's no consistent geographic pattern and there's no consistent sort of bias towards forest recovery versus decreasing forest cover, it definitely does not support the idea that Amazonia was the source of the Orbis spike. If we show these same data a different way, this is now looking at time bins going back to 2000 years ago. And here we've got 10% increase in forest cover compared to the previous time bin. We got 5% increase, 10% decrease, 5% decrease. So when we have more purple than green, overall, we're seeing a trend towards land clearance. When we have more green than purple, we're seeing a trend towards forest recovery. There are plenty of sites which are neutral through this. Right? But again, if we look at the Great Dying period here, it's a wash. We see an equal amount basically showing increase versus decrease. There's no smoking gun there saying that this was suddenly a change towards forest recovery. The period before shows much stronger signal of forest recovery, and the strongest signal of all is back here, or you can sort of writ large in this block from about 1,000 years ago until 1,500 years ago. The time of maximum clearance, interestingly, looks to be back between about 350 to 750 AD as well. So this is certainly, to me, what's interesting about this is it's taking my attention away from the Great Dying period and saying, hey, something is going on before this, right? We've got this surge of occupation and of clearance back here, and then we have a surge of forest recovery, probably abandonment of sites that is fully 500 years earlier than European arrival. If we go to those 9 more detailed sites that we have, then we see this is the pattern. We have the sites which are shown with orange had at least 45% of samples contained maize, and we see that none of them have a strong uptick during the Great Dying. We see consistently that the turnaround is considerably earlier than that. If we go to sites which show more moderate occupation, it's actually just the same period. And if we go same signal, and if we go to sites with sort of no occupation, and notice here, this is oscillating between 94% and 99% forest cover. So this is just completely forested. There is no signal here at all in these records. Another way of thinking about this is superimposing all those forest covers and asking about what happened to the preceding 100 years. Do we have a change in forest cover? And again, there is no consistent signal through here. We have the black bar here shows the overall mean. We have the individual 9 high resolution sites plotted as superimposed figures. We see that trend turning around about 1,000 years ago, leading back towards an increasing forest cover. If we look at Cecropia, this is the sort of the sparrow of the Amazon in terms of trees. And it's the first pioneer that you're going to see in a lot of settings as the land is fallowed. And so, you know, this sort of classic spike that we see here at one of the sites, that looks exactly like a fallowing kind of spike here. This is another one, here's another one here, there's another one here, but there's nothing during the Great Dying. So the Cecropia, which is what we'd expected to signal the start of that recovery of these sites, there's no indication of it being within the time of European arrival. Fire, you know, the expectation here would be that people were burning the sites right up until they abandoned the sites, but we see no pattern in the charcoal indices here. I don't really have time to talk about how the index was developed, but basically we'd expect this to be peaks tightly lined up to this if it was the Great Dying that was causing this pattern. So our data for something interesting happening about 1,000 years ago are not alone. Several archaeologists, I'm seeing Phil Rearis and Roy O'Callaghan have put out some nice papers talking about the density of archaeological dates through time. And this is an analysis that's very parallel to theirs that we did with archaeological settings. And we see this is the number of 14 carbon dates that are attributed to time bins coming from archaeological sites, from soil charcoal, from terra pretas, and from geoglyphs. Again, we don't see the peaks of these things falling at the start of the Great Dying or within the Great Dying period. What we see is that they tend to bias to at least 100 years earlier if we're looking at archaeological sites. And when we're looking at soil charcoal, you can certainly argue that it's a spread out peak that sort of starts to tail down somewhere around 1,200 years ago. Same thing with terra pretas. These are entirely independent data sets. Again, tailing off about 1,200 years ago. So I think this is the really interesting thing that's coming out of this study is to refocus our attention on these other time periods to say what was going on here. You know, so I don't mean this to be a negative thing about the Great Dying. I think we're showing that this probably wasn't what's really interesting here. What is interesting is this other time period. So just to go back to this idea about the Great Dying and the Orbis spike, this is the pattern that we would have expected to see had the Orbis spike been explained through reforestation. But in fact, we find that regrowth is happening back here, and there really is no signal at all in the global CO2 record at that time, suggesting that the Amazonian forest system really wasn't a big player, or at least human manipulation of that forest system wasn't a big player in prehistory. So I'm getting close to time. I've got another whole branches to go on, but I'm going to skate over this because I think I need to wrap this thing up. So there is a question about legacy effects and what happens from these pre-Columbian activities into modern systems. And the answer to that really is that it's very complicated. So we can see additions such as Mauritia palms and Brazil nuts, and sometimes those are clearly associated with archaeological settings. And if these are long-lived trees, then yes, they may be associated with those settings. But were those settings last used by pre-Columbians, or were they last used during the rubber boom? You know, there's a lot of extra thought that needs to go into this, and the simple knee-jerk response to say, oh, these things are pre-Columbian isn't right. The overprinting of rubber boom activity on top of archaeological settings looks to be fairly strong. It's something which Crystal, Michael, and I have been working on. We're going to have a grant proposal looking at that pretty soon. And so I think that there's just a lot of complexity to this. So I'm going to skate through these slides because I was overly optimistic in what I could talk about today and just get to my conclusions. So basically, if you are running forest field sites, we really recommend going in there with a soil auger and looking for charcoal fragments. You can individually date those charcoal fragments and they'll tell you when your forest last burned. We're seeing, you know, a lot of the University of Amsterdam group has been very active in looking at this, finding this recent paper that came out in PNAS this week with Dolores Piperno as lead author on it. But there's Britta Heijink and others have produced really cool papers on this, and I encourage you to go off and take a look at those, because it's important to know if you're dealing with any kind of successional, what the successional state of your forest is, and some of these results are quite surprising. So my conclusions then, we don't support the great dying explanation of the Orbis spike as it applies to Amazonia. We find this early regrowth forest to have begun centuries before European arrival. And we have to express that, you know, some doubt about the simplicity of the argument of a mass mortality in the Amazon when we can't see it and when we find no evidence of it. So I'm not saying it didn't happen, I just want to look at this much more closely, and I think it's something which we need to revisit as a community to think about again, rather than just simply saying, oh, it happened in Mexico and it happened in the Andes, it must have happened in the Amazon as well. I don't think that's necessarily true. Our ecological legacies that we see, we have to think about pre-Columbian and post-Columbian factors in that, as it's going to be a complicated story. But the bottom line here is that if we find high or low densities of tree species that we consider to be useful, we should not immediately assume that that has got anything to do with pre-Columbian land use and legacies. I've got some acknowledgements to make here. First of all, this is an immense collaboration with people all over the place, but my lab group works very closely with that of the University of Amsterdam, with Crystal McMichael, Will Gosling over there, and their students. And then I've got members of my team who've now moved on to other appointments, Christine Ackerson, who's now at St. Andrews, Majoy Nascimento, who's now at the University of Amsterdam, Brian Valencia, who's now at ICIAM in Ecuador, and then Warren Church, who's been an immense resource for us in terms of expertise in Chachapoyan archaeology, who's at Georgia State University, is very much thanked for all of their contributions to this, and then our funding agencies as well, of course. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much for that. And I encourage people to switch on your cameras for the Q&A session as well. It's nice to see an audience there for this. But thanks for that very careful and detailed exposition of also how your thinking has developed over time and shaped this. And I have a few questions, but I see we have Simon Lewis here, one of the authors of the Orbis spike hypothesis around the Great Dying. So I'll hand over to Simon to ask the first question.
Hi there, Mark. Thanks for the talk. So I think there's a mistake in the thinking, and there's a mistake in the paper that you wrote, to think that the Amazon is the most important place for the drawdown of carbon dioxide to contribute to the Orbis spike, just because it's a big forest. It's actually the locations of where the people were who then died, where the environmental conditions are to allow carbon sequestration following abandonment. So, and I think there's a misunderstanding around the scales here. So as you said at the beginning, so we took every population estimate we could possibly find in lots of different branches of science, and then computed what we thought were the range of pre-Columbian population sizes, and we came on a central estimate of around 60 million. And of that, as you said, the kind of middle estimates are sort of, 2 to 5 million for the Amazon region itself. So it's only sort of 5 to 10% of all the people who were there. And we know most of the population reduction was outside. So I think you can find complicated idiosyncratic patterns across different locations in your pollen records, without that necessarily linking back to the really big picture. So just to put the context, Latin America is 1.9 billion hectares in size, and we estimate, based on the land use per capita at the time of a European arrival, then we have recovery over about 56 million hectares. So only around 3%. So if you go for this kind of statistical, like haphazard approach of taking lakes where they naturally form and then sampling them, then you're probably not going to find it a priori. You're not going to see it. So then to say this is not evidence of this drawdown, I think is taking the data and then making statements that I don't think you can make from the data. And I know that wasn't a question, and people who don't ask questions is annoying at the end of seminar. So I do also have a question about the specifics. So you have this graph where you take a statistical approach and you say we've got these 39 sites, and here's the change in the amount of forest taxa pollen. And if population has changed over time, sort of generally increased over those 2,000 years until maybe the Orbis site, maybe not, but you don't show any trend in forest loss compared to forest gain from the pollen. There's just a big stack of changes above the line and a big stack below, and no trend, even though one would expect over more 1,500 years the population to have been increasing overall. So I just worry, I wonder what you think about the sensitivity of those pollen records to actually detecting trends in forest cover.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And I mean, I think I want to comment a little bit about your comment. We were not saying that the Orbis spike couldn't be associated with other areas, but in Amazonia, which had been highlighted as one of the areas likely to be triggering it, we were pointing out that doesn't appear to be the case. Right? So in commenting
it can only be 5 to 10% of the whole thing if it's equal, people died, equal probability all over.
But it's not, I mean, it's got to be about productivity. It's got to be about land area as well to generate that amount of carbon.
The land area is small. It's 1.1 hectares per person.
Yeah.
Did the Koch paper estimate how much of the effect could be in Amazonia in that analysis? I can't remember.
We do have a breakdown, but the problem is that once you get to each region, you don't have that many population estimates, and you don't have that many per capita land use estimates. So it makes it difficult to make like really solid statements.
So going on to your actual question, I think the point there is that the pollen is sensitive at each location to what's happening. Of course, there are huge areas there which we can't monitor because we don't have the records there. Amazonia is sort of lake limited, which is a weird thing to say when there's so many lakes apparently in the Amazon, but most of those lakes are not suitable for this kind of analysis. So, but we do have other lakes in mind where we want to go and test this now. So we regard this as a hypothesis that we're raising that now needs to be tested. And I think the most interesting part of it, as I said, is not that we are attempting to debunk the Orbis thing. I think that the most interesting thing is that we're pointing attention to an earlier period where there appears to be forest recovery, and that there is something different happening there than we anticipated. And so I think that's the set of hypotheses really that I want to go after. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, we could leave it there.
I mean, people lived around lakes. They like to live around lakes. And so we tend to have a bias towards finding people when we look at lakes. So to that extent, they're unusually sensitive of what's happening with people.
Yes.
But there are not many, they're not really the mean change of those green bars above and the gray bars below. They don't show any kind of divergence where you're just getting more and more land use by people as the population grows over 1,500 years. It's like,
yeah, but then there could be changes in how people are managing the land. So the archaeologists tend to think now that there is a shift from out and out cultivation toward forest management, in which you wouldn't necessarily, you make the forests more productive for the people by having more fruit trees and things within them, rather than simply clearing them. And so you may not end up with a trend towards mass deforestation in that last 1,000 years.
So if you have a trend towards better forest management and less clearing to keep without any additional clearing, because that's how you're dealing with your increase in population, and then some of that population dies off, does it not change the forest very much? Because
it doesn't change the carbon very much.
So then you might not see it.
Well, then you're not going to get a carbon effect from it.
Yeah. I thought we already agreed that
okay.
because there aren't very many people in the first place.
So I mean, I'm only showing you the summary diagrams here, right? So we can actually do this down to genus to a large extent, and that's what we're actually looking at. And so yes, we're seeing some substantial changes within forest structure, which I didn't get a chance to talk about today, which are kind of interesting.
Great. Yeah, it's good to let that discussion roll a bit. So I had a question that's related to that. Given these lakes that are sampled, and you're saying there's a bias towards people settling in lakes, and I think most of your lakes seem to have people, but some didn't. Mm-hmm. So can you infer from that whether that middle or high population estimates for pre-Columbian Amazonia is more likely? Obviously, there's a bit of extrapolation there, but do you feel if you were at those high levels, would you expect every lake to have people there if you're those middle estimates? So is this number more consistent with these more middle estimates?
Yeah, I think part of this, I mean, I'm certainly not going to put a number on it, and I don't really know. I mean, my gut feeling is that the middle estimate is a better estimate than the really high estimate. But I think there's been some confusion introduced by terms like, I'm just trying to think what they've used, carrying capacity. And so Phil Rierson and Manuela Arroyo-Kalin put out a paper which talks about carrying capacity. And I think what they are talking about is a sort of social carrying capacity, although they don't define it. To an ecologist, that's a very different thing. So, to me, carrying capacity in ecology is every piece of food goes into the next mouth that you're trying to feed. You're trying to get your K to plateau as high as you possibly can. Whereas with social carrying capacity, you might have a much lower density of population because of warfare or because of jealousy or because of just strife in general. And so I think, or even disease. And so I think that their use of carrying capacity is a little unfortunate in that, without refining the definition of it. But I think if you go back to the basis of what they're talking about, which is to look at these archaeological data and the density of ages, they quite clearly peak at about 1200 AD and are tailing down by the time you get to sort of European arrival. And that hasn't been explained yet. Now, is that a bias because archaeologists don't have a ton of money and they tend to date the oldest thing in their sequence and they're not dating the stuff on top? Possibly. Or is it a genuine pattern? I mean, I started thinking it was a biased pattern. I'm now beginning to believe it's a genuine pattern because it aligns so closely with what we're seeing in these other data sets.
Okay. And then following on for that, so what do you think are plausible hypotheses for what went on around 1200 that could drive these shifts?
There's evidence that from the archaeological data, there's evidence that people were taking up more defensive postures, both in the Andes and in the Amazon about 1,000 years ago. And so people moved out of the valley bottoms up onto ridge lines, which are more defensible. In the Amazon, they started to build stockades. There's a bit more evidence of bashed in skulls in the Andes. I'm not sure we found any skulls in the Amazon to show that. But it's Eduardo Neves, who I have a lot of respect for him as an archaeologist. I think he is actively looking at this period as well as being a sort of social turning point in the Amazon. And so I really don't know. I mean, it's not impossible that it's a disease spreading through the Amazon earlier than we know about. Depends on how far-fetched you want to go. Could it have come from the original Greenland contact and come down through the Americas, 1,000 years ago? I don't know. There's certainly the possibility that as the Wari up in the Andes were herding animals more densely, about 1,000 years ago, zoonotic diseases may have been transferred into the human population and made their way down. Or this could be just pure social unrest causing people in outlying areas to collapse in onto a more defensible central location, and that you get a tacit abandonment even though your population isn't contracting. So, I don't know. I think it needs a lot more work.
Fascinating. Just to add to that mix of left field theories, there must have been some exchange with Polynesians as well. We know sweet potatoes got across into the Pacific. Chicken bones were found in the western coast of South America. So that could have been another possible entry point for tropical diseases. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we haven't been particularly focused on this time period before. And I think now is the time to think about it. It's great to see the archaeologists are also interested in it, coming at it from their own direction. Mm-hmm. So I think, in 10 years' time, we may know some more.
Okay, does anybody else have any more questions? Simon, any more points? Feel free. There's an interesting thing to pitch in on.
I mean, I guess I keep going back to. I mean, I don't do any archaeology. I mean, any paleo stuff myself, but work as part of a team, particularly in the Congo basin around the peatlands, and I'm kind of struck by the attempt in your work, Mark, to say something about the whole Amazon region based on 39 locations, which each sort of pollen inputs from a pretty small area. I don't know how big the average is. Whether it's sort of
a few kilometers around,
tens of hectares or more, but not
thousands,
not very much. Yeah. Pretty small inputs. And then when you look at each of those records and how many samples there are, within the within the 1500 1500 to 1700 bracket, it's usually one per site, and then the sampling of the dating.
Well, you don't need more than one per site. That's an odd statement. Okay.
No, I mean the actual number of pollen samples within each.
You're talking about cores, or?
No, not cores. The sampling within the.
Well, we've got about 15-year intervals on quite a few of these records now.
Like how you go from that to scaling to the Amazon.
Well, you got to start somewhere.
I guess the point there is, as Mark made earlier in this seminar, what other direct lines of evidence are? There's the anecdote, there's the historical record, which is quite poor, and otherwise we have very little other direct evidence from the Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, I would not pretend that this is a story that is complete. I think, the most exciting science is when you can raise hypotheses for other people to go ahead and disprove or to test or whatever. And I think that the Orbis spike hypothesis was very helpful, right? It generated us to go and think about it in a way we hadn't been thinking about it before. Have we got the answer right? Don't know, we'll find out. But this is where we are with it at present. And I think what we're doing is we're now building on that and raising some other hypotheses that hopefully other people are going to go ahead and test. And that's just exactly how science ought to be proceeded.
Yeah, I don't disagree. There's no doubt that piecing together the evidence around that dip in CO2 about whether it's related to land or not, it is very controversial, and we don't know for sure. The climate models suggest that you can't reproduce that event without some residual impact from the land. But there are all sorts of arguments against that as well.
So I actually had a question
Very
for you.
uncertain.
How many of the Antarctic records actually show that event?
So there's only two. So it needs to be ultra high resolution. So there's only two so far, and one. So there's two. One shows a much sharper dip and then a response, and then an upwards with the one you plotted, and then the second one goes down and it doesn't have that extra dip, and then goes back up. So that's why you see people write 6 to 10 or 7 to 10 parts per million. And I know that they've been doing for a long while now an array of cores to try and get that, to try and replicate to see which one of those two cores is closer to what we think is the truth. And I haven't seen that come out yet.
So just to yank your chain, you're basing your argument on one core.
No, two.
One which doesn't really show it, and one which does.
No, they both show it, but one shows 10 parts per million and one shows 7.
Okay.
But yeah, that like you say, I mean, the good thing about CO2 is it's very well mixed in the atmosphere.
So you keep telling us.
Great. Well, it's good to have that debate. Does anybody else have any more questions? Otherwise, I think we can wrap up. But thank you, Mark, for that exposition. I think it was really interesting to have you talk through the details of some of these sites and what you're finding there as well.
All right.
And opening up this whole arena of what actually happened about 1,000 years ago. I think a really interesting set of questions there as well, whatever the story around the Great Dying turns out to be. So thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
We have a tradition in these seminars to unmute as an audience and give an audible